Some call them the Conservation Olympics, 2 weeks of debate and voting on trade in endangered animals. From tuna to timber, from tigers to tree frogs, 23,000 animal and plant species come under the spotlight. Who are the winners and losers, and are wholesale trade bans the best way to save our species? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Nick Clark and welcome to the programme from the Sheraton Hotel here in Doha in Qatar, the venue of the 15th Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Inside the hotel, 1,200 delegates arguing about the whys and wherefores of the balance between conservation and trade. It is a very prickly issue. This is the beginning of week 2. Week 1 has already been pretty eventful. Here's Beth and Hal.
It's the world's largest wildlife trade convention, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. Its aim is to regulate the international wildlife trade and ensure it remains sustainable. Its mandate covers everything from rare Brazilian trees to the American bobcat. This year, debates include the trade of ivory, coral and polar bears. But the species that featured most heavily in the run-up to this year's conference is the Atlantic bluefin tuna. It's fished in international waters, with 80% of it going to Japan, where it's considered a delicacy. But its numbers have fallen by 60% in the last decade. Although there are regulations aimed at conserving bluefin tuna, activists were calling on CITES to ban its trade.
It's desperate that the governments here need to look at the science and do the right thing for the long term of the species, not only for the short term of fisheries interests.
But it wasn't to be. A discussion had been scheduled on the fate of bluefin tuna on Thursday, after, albeit heated, preliminary submissions. In a surprise call, Libya asked for an immediate vote on the ban. 68 out of 129 members voted against it, with 30 abstentions. So the proposal failed. In reaction to the vote, the WWF said, after overwhelming scientific justification and growing political support in past months, with backing from the majority of catch quota holders on both sides of the Atlantic, it is scandalous that governments did not even get the chance to engage in meaningful debate about the international trade ban proposal. There are also various types of fish, including several species of shark, up for a change of status at CITES. But even if they make it into Appendix 2, that's the piece of legislation that restricts the trade of the species listed, it doesn't mean they're totally protected. The whale shark was added to Appendix 2 in 2002. The species is labelled as vulnerable. By law, trade is restricted, but it continues in many countries, and campaigners say the restrictions aren't enough and policing is necessary. On the same day the bluefin tuna ban was defeated, the conference also failed to pass a ban on the trade of polar bears. It's halfway through, and CITES has already been accused of not being strong enough against well-funded lobbyists to protect the endangered species it is charged with. The conference has a week left to redeem itself in the eyes of campaigners, but it'll be years before the planet can measure what, if any, impact CITES has had on the wildlife it's supposed to preserve. Beth Ann Howe, Inside Story.
You find us inside the Sheraton now to talk about all things CITES, and to do just that, we're joined by our 3 guests. Will Travers, who's Chief Executive of the Born Free Foundation, which is an international wildlife charity. Also welcome Charles Clover, a journalist and author of the book, The End of the Line. And finally, Jorn Peterson, who's an advisor to the Norwegian Fishermen's Association. Gentlemen, welcome all. I'd like to start with this big issue of the bluefin tuna. There was a real sense of disappointment in the halls amongst the delegates and so forth. Very surprised that the ban was not passed. A lot of work, a lot of investment had been put into the whole campaign, and suddenly it was all over. Will Travers, if the evidence is so clear, why couldn't CITES, as a mechanism, as a conference, convince the delegations that the ban should have happened?
That's a very good question, and you say that a lot of the delegates were disappointed. I think actually a lot of the delegates were exactly the opposite. They were pleased that it didn't go through. Personally, from Born Free SSN's point of view, we were deeply disappointed because we thought that the evidence was compelling, it was overwhelming, and that the existing mechanisms for controlling the catch of tuna and then the trade in tuna simply haven't worked in the past, and there seems to be little prospect necessarily that they'll work in the future. So we were very disappointed, but I think the reason partly behind it was just the huge overwhelming investment in the issue that was made by the consuming nations, and in particular Japan. Japan made a huge, they've got a delegation of approximately 50 people here, which tells you how seriously they're taking this issue, and they were working the story, working the issue, whereas the European Union spent so long internalizing the whole thing, talking about it to themselves. They did not get out, as good campaigners do, on the stump and talk about their issues and persuade parties to their point of view.
So it was a kind of politicking error rather than actually a chance to examine the evidence and people making a decision from that.
Yes, it was heavily political and driven by big money. Big money in tuna. It's not one of these peripheral issues that people pay a little bit of attention to because it's not worth very much in economic terms. This is a trade convention after all. And when you talk about tuna, you're talking about an industry that's worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds, millions of dollars.
Okay, Jon Peterson, your view is that a ban would have been wrong in the first place?
Well, yes, I think that you had this outcome because of delegates found that it was evidence that the best way to manage the tuna is within ICCAT. And you have had some good improvements in ICCAT in their last meetings, and you have also had some encouraging signals for the future.
And ICCAT, I should say, is this kind of universal, there's a global tuna organization.
Yeah, that's a regional fisheries management organization which is responsible for managing this species. And it's obvious that the bluefin tuna has problems, and it needs to be improved. And I think we are going in that direction now.
But isn't the bottom line, Charles Clover, that it's simply bad business, isn't it, to exploit a resource to zero?
Yes, I'm rather surprised by the arguments about livelihoods put up by the Arab states and the Arab League on behalf of the North African countries, because if this thing goes down, if the bluefin tuna isn't there, a lot of people are going to have no job forever. Whereas we were talking about, this week, we were talking about people not having so much of a job for a bit. We were talking about not having this huge hungry maw of the Japanese market, where 80% of the bluefin tuna goes. There would still have been domestic markets which wouldn't have put fishermen out of business. It would have meant that actually we could have invested in the fishery. The only way you invest in wild capture fisheries is by not catching the fish.
Now, you've written a book about this whole thing, this whole issue. And in your research for that and the people you've met here, what have you found the Japanese argument is?
The sophisticated Japanese say, well, it's that we must leave the competence of this with the regional fisheries management organizations of the world, of which ICCAT, the Atlantic Tuna Commission, is one.
So they're arguing about the science as well.
That is their argument. Well, the word science is actually the one that's been most trammeled this week, because, I mean, there was a perfect case accepted by the Atlantic Tuna Commission's own scientists, by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, that the bluefin tuna had met the criteria, that it was an endangered species. It is an endangered species, and it's sunk to the stage where a ban would be appropriate. All the authorities agree. So actually, if this is a convention that protects endangered species, it just failed, you know? So it's a very big one. I was talking to somebody at lunch who said this is the worst kind of discussion we've ever had in the 20 years I've been coming here, because we didn't have it. This was just a bunch of people from fishing countries who came along and said, we're not going to have the discussion. Now, that's really not a very good result for this particular convention. It's going to look, I mean, it's a mistake so big that, you know, the public's going to notice.
Which makes you wonder about the efficacy, the mechanism itself, of CITES itself.
Well, I'm not sure that it's necessarily CITES' problem at this point in time, because the focus has been, as Jon says, on ICCAT as a regional fisheries management system. The thing is that ICCAT has failed and continued to fail, and notwithstanding the amendments to procedure that have been introduced, I still think it's likely to fail. I guess the only thing we can kind of hang our hat on here is that over the next 3 years, between this conference of the parties to CITES and the next conference to the parties to CITES, we'll be looking at ICCAT. And if ICCAT continues to fail, we'll come back with a much stronger position in 2012 probably, and I think it will then be irresistible. I hope it will be an irresistible case. The problem is we'll probably have lost another 20,000, 30,000 tonnes of tuna in the process.
Whether we can afford to do that, I'm not sure.
Oh, well, indeed.
Jorn?
Well, I think CITES can play a role, especially in that a listing would be cause so much problems to fisheries and to nations and to other tuna fisheries eventually. So the very threat of having a listing will motivate, for instance, ICCAT to improve their management. So I acknowledge that it is maybe a good thing that the possibility of a CITES listing of fisheries species is there, but that may be the only or one of the only one of the few good things about CITES listings.
But I mean, come back to this point. Isn't the bottom line that if the resource is running out, if it's a species that's about to go extinct, it's just ridiculous to keep fishing for it, keep trading in it, and that applies to other species as well?
Well, the issue is you have to deal with this in the fisheries management authorities, and whether or not you ban the international trade, you could still have a fishery for the domestic markets. And in many cases, you see proposals from, for instance, the EU, where their fishermen could go on fishing because they don't need the export market. They have a big enough domestic market, so the ban wouldn't mean any difference to EU fishermen.
Okay, Charles.
Well, I think there is a danger of looking at this as a rivalry between organizations and not as the result that we all should want, which is that these species get conserved in a better way than they are at present. I mean, my view is that ICCAT has failed. It was the original regional fisheries management organization. It didn't save the bluefin in the western stock, and it's now failing to save the bluefin in the eastern stock. It's a historical record of failure. So why anybody should think that it's now going to be able to, on the basis of one meeting last November, do it all right in future is just, fantasy land, frankly. But the reality is we want this thing done properly, and if ICCAT is going to be given strength and courage to make the right decisions as a result of this, we should not criticize that. We should think that's marvelous. And I think also within Europe, having gone through this tortuous process, which of course left them with no time to do any diplomacy, a tortuous process of actually getting the 27 member states to agree on something, albeit nobody could quite understand what, but it sort of said, a ban on trade. Having got them all through that hurdle, they can't go back, because now when they go to ICCAT, they've actually got to set a quota that's based on science. Now, they've never done that before. They've always said, oh, well, we'll set a quota based on science, but we won't enforce it, so we're all going to take 3 times more than the scientific quota actually is.
The other thing is, don't you have to wonder how successful CITES bans can be anyway, because infringements still take place. I was out filming here in the region in the UAE, in Sharjah, and there was a whale shark on display for sale, openly for sale, and that's CITES 1, isn't it? That's Appendix 1. That is banned. That is illegal.
It is, and I mean, obviously enforcement is a huge issue. You can have all the agreements in the world under CITES, but unless they are enforced, and it's one of the continuing laments. I've been to every CITES conference since 1989. It's the broken record approach, which is we'll make this decision, but where's the money to do the enforcement? Where's the capacity building to do the enforcement? And we're still having that argument and that debate now. So you will be able to go out and find, huge amounts of sharks being landed, and you say, well, what's happening to this surely this is driving species to extinction, and the answer is it is. 70 to 100 million sharks a year are being caught. There is no sustainable shark fishery that I'm aware of. In fact, interestingly, I recall a couple of years ago, Disney was going to hold a huge banquet in Hong Kong and serve shark's fin soup, and we approached Disney and said, this isn't a good idea, and they said, well, don't worry, we're going to serve only from a sustainable shark fishery. 2 months later, they came back and said, we can't find one, we've taken it off the menu. Right. So, you know, enforcement is an absolutely top priority, and it gets very little discussion at these kind of conferences.
And is there also an argument that perhaps a ban, in a sense, encourages illegal trade?
No, you know this with the tigers and their
yeah, I mean,
with the tigers and rhinos, I mean, it gives the animals value, doesn't it? I mean,
I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, you could say that about elephants and ivory. You know, you've got a situation where the ban came in 1989, and when the ban came in, sort of counter to the logics of economics, the price of ivory plummeted, the amount of poaching that took place plummeted, and we had stabilization of elephant populations in many countries and growth in others. It was only when, in 1997, that there was started this talk about erosion of the ban, the first one-off sale in 1999 of a big stockpile of ivory, and then another sale that took place in 2008. As you see the ban being eroded, you see demand increasing, and these one-off sales, a big stockpile of ivory, simply doesn't meet demand. I mean, that was the mistake, frankly, that the British government made last time round. They thought, sell 100 tons of ivory, demand will be satisfied, prices will depress, poaching will go down. Exactly the opposite. Prices went up, now at an all-time high. Poaching is at pretty much record levels in parts of Africa, and huge amounts of ivory, illegal ivory, are being intercepted. It's about as wrong as you can get it.
Jorn Petersen?
Well, going back to the fisheries issues, you know, having major commercial fisheries on CITES appendices will demand resources for enforcement and implementation from CITES that is unprecedented. And even with the tasks that CITES have today, the resources are quite limited, and the budgets are going down instead of up. So obviously the governments should address the fisheries management within the regional fisheries management organizations instead of in bodies like CITES.
well, I think that's a good point.
Because and also if you take the EU, they have been forgive me for saying this, but they have been pretty much the problem within ICCAT, and the same countries are here trying to impose these problems all over all the world instead of using their opportunity to solve the problems where it should be solved.
Okay, Charles?
Well, this is a convention on endangered species, and the bluefin is now an endangered species, so it should be under it.
Well,
I mean,
even though
there are 24,000 plant species that are, as far as I know, that are under this convention, and 4,000 animal species. I don't see what's so different about marine fish. This argument that Japan is constructing, that we shouldn't have any commercial marine fish stocks on this convention at all, is just rubbish, because we've already got sturgeon, we've already got every rainforest tree, so why is that so difficult? I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there would have to be a scaling up in the amount of money that was spent on CITES if you were going to actually properly manage these populations under it. If you were going to put bluefin on, you'd have to spend more money. And what happens at the end of every CITES conference is a kind of Dutch auction in which people say, the chairman says, oh, should we spend this sum of money on it? And they'll go, no, I don't think so. And should we spend this sum of money on it? I don't think so. Should we spend this sum of money that's below inflation on it? And they'll all go, yeah, we'll do that. So, you know, this really is a very stupid way of funding this organization if you expect it to work.
So you come back to the main point that we started with, that CITES as an organization just isn't working.
Oh, no, I disagree. I mean, I've invested a lot of time in the convention, and I think it does work, or it can work, but it needs to have the political will, it needs to have the resources to do it, and I don't think that enforcement is down to the CITES Secretariat, the people who run the convention. I think that enforcement is down to the parties, it's down to the countries. If you vote on something, you have to have the responsibility of carrying through the vote into the real world. You actually have to then say, okay, we have agreed to this, we will therefore fund the measures necessary to implement it. Otherwise, we're making policy and delivering policy with no responsibility whatsoever for actually delivering it in practical terms on the ground. And I think that's if there's a failure, I think that's one of them. And the second one, actually, I think is this big debate about information, about data. I think it's becoming far too predicated on we won't take a decision because we don't have quite enough data on this species. And the founding fathers of CITES anticipated this by establishing something called the precautionary principle. And in simple terms, it means if there is doubt, the benefit of the doubt should go to the species, not to trade.
Okay, and that brings me to the point that it's clear that whole industries are built up on trade in animals, be it fish or whatever it is, be it ivory. And that's the thing, isn't it? Because you implement a ban and you suddenly take away this word, livelihoods. And that's something that you're quite passionate about.
Well, I think you have to take people's interests into account if you're going to have a successful conservation. If you impose on people bans and measures that goes contrary to their existence, you won't motivate them to do good management. And all we see is evidence of that if you have a successful management, then you have most likely have involvement and understanding from the people involved. Like in Norway, within the fisheries management, we have involvement from the industry, and it's unthinkable for us to ask for unsustainable quotas.
Okay, Will?
Well, I sort of tend to agree in some respects, because I think it is terribly important to involve and include the sort of human dimension in all of this. But let me explain. If you put a species like tigers on what's called Appendix 1, which means no commercial trade whatsoever, it does actually mean that we failed in terms of management. That's the solution for when we failed in terms of management and we have only one resort left, and that is to say absolutely no trade whatsoever. It's now all about protection, enforcement. If you have species on Appendix 2 and you get the management right, it should never end up in Appendix 1. It should be managed. However, if you reach a crisis point, coming back to bluefin tuna, where you have a species that is almost commercially extinct and is heading that way rapidly, and your only option, and in my view it is the only option, is to place that species on Appendix 1, no commercial trade, we've allowed that, we, people, have allowed that situation to arrive, and we must therefore compensate, buy out the fishing fleets, pay people off, reshape the industry in order to deal with the human dimension, which is important, absolutely vital.
We're coming towards the end of the programme, but just to come full circle, Charles, when the next CITES meeting happens in, 2.5 years' time, how much pressure do you think will have been applied on the bluefin tuna by this continuing trade?
There will be probably a few disasters in the bluefin tuna area, because there will be, undoubtedly, because ICCAT is not good at regulating, there will be a lot of people who overfish. Now, what is done about them will be the test of ICCAT. I mean, Japan has made tremendous pledges, actually, quite interestingly, in this conference, that it is going to crack down on illegal fishing. It never managed it before, and to make ICCAT work, which it hasn't. Now, I think we should take those undertakings from Japan in good faith. But I think the thing that will really happen between now and the next conference, if the bluefin is able to survive that long, which is a question, is that I think that what will happen now is that the view of the public will start to prevail. Because, I mean, this was actually a little ambush by the fishing industry in a country that many people consider to be a long way away from where they are. So this will hit the wider public. This has been such a mess, a disaster of process, that I think people will notice. And actually, it's the rest of us, it's the citizen that owns these animal species, the citizen that owns the sea. And their voice has not been heard. And I think their voice will be heard increasingly over the next 3 years.
All right, well,
saying, do we want our resources managed as irresponsibly as this?
It'll be interesting, as I say, to see where we are when the next conference comes around. Gentlemen, thanks very much indeed. Will Travers, Charles Clover, and Jorn Peterson, thanks very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget, email address, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Do drop us any thoughts or suggestions. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.